Hey everyone, Mr. Happy here, and in this video, I'm going to be sharing with you my thoughts on Fantasian Neo Dimension, a game that was just published by Square Enix in December of 2024. This turn-based RPG is something that hardcore fans of the genre have known about for years and patiently waited to be available on most platforms. However, many of you may have no idea what game I'm even talking about. So before we get into my review, I'm going to give you a little bit of a history about Fantasian, its developers, and how it eventually came to this Neo Dimension version. So Fantasian Neo Dimension is actually not a brand new game. It's actually an enhanced version of the original Fantasian that released back in 2021. This was a game developed by Mistwalker, the studio under none other than Hironobu Sakaguchi, the grandfather of the Final Fantasy franchise, who left Square Enix back in 2003. Their company is also known for several other RPGs, most notably Blue Dragon, Lost Odyssey, and Terra Battle. The game was originally published exclusively on the Apple Arcade back in 2021, released in two parts. The first part focused entirely on a largely linear narrative with a handful of backtracking elements, while the second part introduced more open-world elements and an array of potent character and world development quests, while of course finishing the game's story and providing some post-game. Now in 2024, Square Enix obtained publishing rights and released this enhanced version that we're talking about here, Fantasian Neo Dimension. It's currently available on Steam and all consoles and introduced a ton of major upgrades. Most notably, it now includes voice acting, which the original did not, and difficulty settings, which was a major point of feedback that Mistwalker received on the original release. It also features tons of music from more recent Final Fantasy titles, including Final Fantasy VII Remake and Rebirth, Final Fantasy XVI, Final Fantasy XIV, and the Pixel remasters. Sakaguchi was convinced to allow most of these changes and have Square Enix publish the title after a discussion with Final Fantasy XIV producer and director Yoshi P. So now that you have a little bit of the history and why I'm producing a video on this game in particular, Fantasian follows the story of Leo, a young boy whom comes down with a case of amnesia after a massive explosion in a factory setting. This is a spoiler-free review, so I really don't want to get any more into it, and all the footage I'm including largely comes from the early portions of the game. And yeah, amnesia, classic trope. Fantasian kind of relishes in these kind of tropes and references across its 50-hour full-time playthrough. Double that approximately if you're going for 100%. But I will say that amnesia trope is a great allegory for the game's entire energy. Everything about it screams classic RPG with a modern twist, minus the clearly still made for mobile menus. The backgrounds are reminiscent of JPEG backgrounds that we used to navigate during the PlayStation 1 era, only this time they're fully physical dioramas that are scanned and placed in the game as opposed to drawn artwork. A lot of people took notice when I was streaming it how realistic the backgrounds looked, like they were made like some sort of specific art style. Well, they were physical items that were scanned into the game, which is why they look the way they do. The battles are a classic turn-based system, only this time attacks exist on a three-dimensional plane, where you can aim and curve them for maximum effectiveness. The game utilizes the third dimension often to offer challenges very unique to the system, having enemies blocking for other enemies or laid out in such a way that you'll need to consider your strategy a bit more than hit big guy with big numbers or just hit them with whatever they're weak to. Some enemies do even utilize the Z-axis. For example, you may have an attack that's animation comes down from above the arena, and you may need to wait for a boss to be looking up in order to expose a weak spot. They really do try to make the maximum use out of all three dimensions, even if it's not all the time, and I definitely found it to be very engaging. The game does do random encounters, but it has an element called the Dimension, which stores random encounters against enemies you've faced at least one time before, up to a limit, at which point you fight them all at once. Despite the overwhelming numbers, you're given buffs that you can aim for with your skills on top of aiming at the enemies, and you'll usually have more enemies lined up and able to be hit by each individual attack, so you can usually cull them a lot faster as well. And then, of course, there's traditional RPG aspects. There's equipment with all sorts of different effects, status effects, elemental weaknesses, and resistances. They all play a role here, and often are at the forefront of enemy and boss design. Don't be surprised if you die to a boss, but come back in a few minutes later with a new set of equipment and absolutely roll them now that you know their deal. Maybe you didn't expect them to be putting your party to sleep nonstop. Bam, pop back out, put sleep resist on, and one of their main mechanics might be entirely shut down. So it really rewards actually failing and going again. Also, though, don't be surprised if you do manage to brute force and limp through them simply by playing well. That's actually what happened through most of my playthrough, with only a handful of battles me actually needing to back out and completely readjust my strategy, mostly towards the end. And since you can actively swap party members in combat, and they all level evenly if they're not used in combat, you can adapt strategies on the fly or think outside the box on team building. I found that I often used 5 to 6 party members in most fights. Some of them I used more in Dimension, some of them I used more on general trash mobs for the first time, and some of them I used more on boss fights than anything else. And even the remaining few that I didn't use, they often had story-specific portions where I could make use of their unique aspects, even if I didn't prefer them otherwise over other characters. And realistically, all of these things are modernizations of the things that defined the era of RPGs that Sakaguchi is most known for, and should appeal to lifelong fans of traditional RPGs, while giving them something brand new at the same time. And keep in mind, I'm glazing over a ton of systems that I really want you to see for the first time when you get to them. The game kept surprising me by offering me new options and ways to power up my team, equipment with very specific effects, and a lot of it was something that I really enjoyed experiencing without knowing those things would be there for the first time. Things that really do make use of the game's balance, and again, that third dimension that it uses in its combat planes. So I'm leaving some of those details out, but please know that there are even more systems in place that are pretty simple to understand, but are there to offer more options, more progression for your character, and to give you a better sense of, well, powering up as you get through the game. I also am not going into spoilers, but I will say that I greatly enjoyed the story. There are some twists and turns that you will absolutely see coming a mile away, and there are some major pacing issues with some 20 to 30 minute exposition dumps, oddly done over flashbacks largely containing static images. This made more sense when the game had no voice acting, but the voice work itself actually causes some of these pacing issues because you're probably listening to the characters actually narrate these things, and thus you will kind of let the game progress at that same speed. Without the voice work, the pacing on them is probably preserved a little bit better if you can actually read through them quickly enough. And I suppose you could still technically do it that way, but I figured it's something that's at least worth mentioning. But keep in mind that despite that, all the characters have great chemistry and the voice work itself is spot on for the most part. The music is also full of absolute bops. While I did play with random music most of the time, so I might have any sort of Final Fantasy 16 music playing at one boss, and the original music for the game playing at another, and Final Fantasy 7 remake or Final Fantasy 14. Like I let the music be on random for the most part for all the battles and encounters, but even still, the game's base soundtrack is really good. And that should come as no surprise given the composer is none other than Nobuo Uematsu, one of Final Fantasy's most prestigious composers over the past 3+ decades. And the content within the game is sprawling as well. While it starts off largely linearly, like I mentioned earlier, the number of side quests and discoverables become high quite fast. I thought I was getting close to the end by the 20-hour mark, but the back half of the game is chock full of branching quest lines, rare equipment, optional super bosses, and tons of story involving world locations, history, and the very characters on your team. This is without factoring in that the game does have New Game Plus, although it doesn't work quite the way that it does in others, but I won't really go too into it because it is kind of a spoiler. But if you want to get 100% for the game, you will absolutely be going through New Game Plus in order to complete the very deadly post-game dungeon. I estimate I'll probably finish my Platinum Trophy at roughly the 90 to 100 hour mark. So all in all, the game really is awesome. Like, there's not much else to say about it. There's just applause for so many different bits. But like I said earlier, it's not like the game is flawless. And honestly, that's kind of standard with traditional RPGs. It feels like most of us just kind of pick and choose the things that allow us to enjoy the game more versus the things that take away from our enjoyment. And I don't know, that's just how traditional RPGs have always felt for me. It's a lot of preferences of systems. You know, I mentioned the pacing issues, which, you know, are exacerbated by voice acting. The UI is very mobile coded. Trust me, I got asked, oh, are you playing some new gacha whenever I stream this? And the bosses, while they're fun, can be frustratingly challenging at times when you first fight them. I must have verbally yelled "ow" out loud to a number of bosses whose attacks were way deadlier than I expected, and several bosses contain difficult gimmicks that require skillful play and timing. One boss, I'm not even kidding, actually made me play the cup game. You know where you put a ball under a cup and you just move all the cups around, you gotta guess the correct one? It wasn't exactly that, but it was the same idea. If I guessed wrong, then the cup blew up in my face. And if I didn't guess at all, I just got attacked 3 times back to back, meaning going in too low on health and not keeping track properly just could end me in an instant on what was otherwise already a difficult boss without that gimmick. There's a lot of really tight DPS checks and a lot of pressure for you to understand how to use ailments, buffing yourself, debuffing enemies, a lot of control that isn't just use your strongest attack, which I'm glad there is. There's plenty of RPGs that are some of my favorites, but quite frankly, I can most of the time just use attack or a single elemental spell and get through the entire thing. Whereas here, the game is constantly pressuring you to manage debuffs that you're getting, things that can be shielded and prevented, there's just all sorts of things that come at you, and I was surprised by each and every boss and how it adapted from the boss that came before it. So if you're someone who likes more challenging RPGs, know that it's fair, it's fun, but the first time through, you might just get caught off guard and killed a handful of times. And keep in mind, I'm talking about on the normal difficulty. When the game originally released, one of the biggest points of feedback that they had was that the back half was way too hard. And so, in Neo Dimension, they have a normal and a hard difficulty. Hard is actually the game's original difficulty when it first released, before it received any changes on the Apple Arcade, which it did have balancing changes then. Normal is the post-balance update, basically the game's intended balance after all of the things Mistwalker did while it was on the Apple Arcade. I didn't play through on hard. I remembered how difficult some of the bosses were, even when I played through a portion of it on Apple Arcade. And I was like, you know what? I want to finish this game without losing my mind. And so weigh those options, because trust me, you might think, oh, it's just hard. No, the game doesn't mess around. All right. You're going to be in for a time on hard mode. If that sounds exciting, go for it. But otherwise, just go normal. Trust me on this one. Now, at the end of the day, if your backlog isn't too full and you're looking for an RPG, I definitely recommend this. And I definitely recommend it at full price. I mean, again, even if you're not going for the New Game Plus 100%, you're basically looking at a 50 to 60 hour game that could be doubled up to 100 plus hours, depending on how quick you actually play through it. So you get plenty of content out of it. You get a great soundtrack. It even has a music feature in the game that you'll eventually unlock, so you can just listen to all the stuff. And it was just a good experience overall. Not the greatest thing I've ever played, but definitely great for me personally. And with that, that's going to be a wrap for my review to Fantasian. Again, sorry there wasn't really a whole lot of editing. It's really easy to spoil certain things in this game, and I really didn't want to use anything from much later than the start of the game in order to avoid that. So best of luck. Anyway, I will see all of you in the next video, and until then, take care.